Welcome to the Energy Tech Podcast, where today we are recording part 7 of our control room management mini-series, as Mike and Daniel will be discussing point-to-point verification. Guys, welcome to the studio.
Hey, Jeff. Good to be here. As usual, right here in Cannonsburg, Pennsylvania, cold Pennsylvania, and in the heart of the Offsite Energy Control Center with my guest, Mr. Daniel Nieto, the expertise in regulatory and compliance. Daniel, you're here, man. Glad you're here with us.
Yeah, glad to be here on the show.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one. If you've been paying attention to the episodes, we mentioned this is leading up to this episode on point-to-point verification, what that really means, how we talk through some of the misnomers or misconceptions about point-to-point, when you're going to want to do that. And with that, Daniel, let's get this thing started, man. Going into the point-to-point, give us an episode overview. What can we expect coming out of this episode?
Yeah, overall, it's about the controllers making sure that the screen, the information that's being placed on the screen is, you can actually trust that information, right?
Yeah.
And that's what point-to-point verification is all about, is making sure that your critical proof and what's being displayed on SCADA is accurate and it reflects what's going on at the field level to ensure, pipeline integrity and alarm credibility. And you definitely want to be able to trust that screen. Once you lose trust on data that's coming in from the SCADA, controllers can go, silent on alarms if they're not responding to them correctly.
Right. And so you're going to walk us through in this episode. We're pretty much going to go through those requirements, kind of, touch on the end-to-end verification that you're talking about from the SCADA system, the field to the SCADA system. Actually, in this case, you're going to do backwards, I guess you would say that, from the field and how it winds up in the SCADA system, what they're actually seeing, and that's part of your verification. And then you'll kind of give us some real-world examples. I think having you on the show, that's one of the things we get to do is you get to bring some real-world experience. I know if I haven't reiterated this in other episodes, Daniel is one of the premier experts in PHMSA and regulatory compliance for control room management. Daniel has probably conducted well over more than half a dozen, at least, audits, and has 0 dings, and has represented customers in those audits as well, clients, actual real-world clients. So he brings lots of expertise, stories, if you will. So that's part of why we get to get a real-world scenario. And then we'll do some safety-related stuff that we'll talk about. And Daniel, you always leave us with what I call your 4-step framework, and then any Q&A to clear up any doubt or answer any questions. So that'll be good. So that's what we can expect on the episode. So give us the regulatory foundation, Daniel. Get us started here on the requirements for trusting SCADA data.
Yeah, so in the system, you want to make sure that at least for your SCADA system, that you can trust that data that's there. As far as from the field level all the way into that console on that screen being displayed. And, PHMSA has this within the code, right? You want to make sure that the, verification of point-to-point is being done, and it can be found in 192 and 195 C2. And when you're going through, an audit, these are the sections that you're going to kind of do a deep dive, and this is exactly what you're going to go over from an audit perspective, is when a point-to-point is required, and what that process looks like, right? What are your safety-related points?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you then is that you're really wanting to know or verifying field instruments, communication links, and your display. So it's sort of like a triangle, if you will, of information. Looking at that field instrument, the communication link is working, and that your SCADA displays are aligned, with the actual values that are being represented from the field device, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking at.
And then would you say right here, that's the core requirement of what we're talking about. Let's address real quick. When we say field instruments, This is pretty much any device, safety related, or whatever is going to give the operator visibility, whether it's on pipeline or a station or block valve sites or a pumping station or a facility that's got tanks, right?
Right, and it's devices that are being added, replaced, or rearranged. Right, there's times where maybe you're going to change the mapping, right? So it can also go from logic and scaling of that mapping that's being changed in your SCADA system. So you always want to make sure you identify what those points are and if they're safety related as well, and make sure that you're capturing those records of that point to point that's being done. And we're going to cover all that through this.
Well, before we do that, I want to ask you, because let's set this up. On the core requirements, from the audit perspective, you want to make sure of these top 5 things. When is the point-to-point required? How thorough is the process from the auditor perspective? There's safety-related points they want to know about. And then you have to have your records of evidence, right, that you did do your point-to-point. And then you got to have your alarm verification at the same time, right?
Yeah. So when you're in this audit, and again, these are all tying into each other as part of the protocol. And, when you're adding that screen display and you're doing this verification, you want to make sure that you're looking at your process, right? Because ultimately that's what they're going to come in and look at. So your procedures in place need to be able to identify what triggers that we spoke about, and then also how you're working through that process to bring in that data. And that's what we're going to be going through here, and making sure that, when is this required? Well, that's in your process, right?
Yeah.
So it flags it.
I have a question right here before we move on. In the audit lens, how thorough is the process? Do you believe that in maybe audits that you've done, what does that mean? Like when someone says, hey, how thorough is the process? Is there something they're hitting on in Q&A, or is it, hey, something someone can point to in a Q&A when they talk about being thorough?
Yeah, so it's definitely in these sections that we're looking at in 192.631. So there's FAQs on this, but within the actual protocol, they want to make sure that, one, what your process looks like, and making sure that when you are actually moving through this process, how's this being captured and what exactly are you doing? So again, if you're adding a new point, did you scale it correctly? What is the name of that point that's being displayed? And, the messages that are coming in when you're doing the testing to validate that, right? You don't want confusion. So, the previous episode, we talked about removing clutter.
Yeah.
Right? This is a part of that as well, right? So we want to make sure when something comes in, it's clear to the controller.
Got it. So if we're going to focus on thorough, you can actually go to that next slide where it's got your, when the point-to-point verification is required, because it really speaks to when, what thorough even means. And you've got these categories. You've got number 1, when there's a replacement, right? Yep. When you're doing a pressure transmitter, flow meter, does that include anything like or kind equipment?
Yes.
Okay. So even on replacement for like and kind, you still want to do that point to point.
Yes, and again, you're going to have your own procedure, right? And you're going to write how you handle your point to point.
Yeah.
Right. But you have to be able to satisfy these questions.
Yeah.
So no matter what your plan says, these are the questions that are going to come up, and how this is in your process.
Right. And so part of the being thorough also includes movement. So if you're replacing instruments that are from like a different tap or a line or something like that, the physical location has changed. You also want to do that point to point.
Yeah, because you could be moving that, right? So you're moving that to another location. So that means another device that's being fed from the field into your SCADA system.
And part of thorough is also modification and rearranging. So this is like, I'm going to change a device range. My scaling parameter has changed. So has the hardware configuration, right?
And what triggers these things, right, Mike? So we spoke about that earlier. So it could be a design, it could be, remapping, and it could also, part of the management change, there could also be, maybe you're dropping pressure, right?
Yeah.
And so you want to make sure that you're scaling it correctly, and you're making sure that you're alarming it correctly, and you want to make sure that you're testing it and validating this.
So in other words, that's when you're going to do you're going to rearrange based on design. You also have that fourth one, which is SCADA changes for lots of the same reasons, where you're altering, mapping and scaling factors, because sometimes engineering has to come in and say, you know what, we want to make some changes, and this is part of that.
Yeah, those operational parameters could change, especially if it comes to safety-related points, and you want to again make sure that what's being displayed for the controller is accurate.
Yeah. So you also point to a rule of thumb. So the rule of thumb is basically, if a change could cause a controller's display or alarms to misrepresent what's happening, follow that rule of thumb for your point-to-point, right?
Yeah.
To align the representation.
Yeah. Make sure you have that in your process.
Got it.
I got a question, Daniel, before we move on. Mike had mentioned like an in-kind replacement. And you'd also mentioned, on some of the other types of changes, doing MOC. So is an MOC required for a like in-kind replacement in the control room outside of the scope of point-to-point?
Again, it could vary from what you have documented. And again, the good rule of thumb is if there's safety-related points are on there, or something that is going to be displayed to a controller, that you want to make sure that you review that. And it may be a couple of points, but you're identifying it within your procedure and how you're handling those things. So I can tell you in the past, those are some of the things that we've done and we had documented, and PHMSA looked at and said, okay, are you also doing this? Because it could be, just again, from a change of a model or anything that you're doing at that field level. It could be a part of remapping that you're bringing in that data. So again, it has to be covered within your procedures or your manuals to make sure you identify some of these areas to answer these questions. So that way you don't go into it blind. You want to make sure that you have that there.
Got it.
Got it.
So let's move on here, Daniel. Give us now. Let's move on to what. Okay, great. We've got those pillars, those 4 pillars and a rule of thumb. What does the thorough point-to-point look like? Again, let's cover that, right? We talked about the field device, right? The instruments initiated any sort of, it's got to be initiated correctly, right? So kind of walk us through these real quick on, what that looks like for a point-to-point, what that.
Yeah, so, these here are critical, right? Because, again, you're doing it from the field level. You're looking at that instrument and how you're going to arrange that and making sure that it's reading correctly locally. So you're making sure that you set that up physically and, how you're programming that from that field level. And then you're going to move over to the next thing, where it's your communication path, right? That could be your RTU, your PLCs, and how that, it could be several things, how that's being communicated to your drivers to interface with your SCADA system, right?
Yeah. You also have, here we're talking about a comms path, and typically involved in the point-to-point, you might have a senior or junior SCADA person that's in the field, hitting a device for a communications path. I have a question, in terms of you're identifying that the link is stable. What is that? Just kind of like, hey, we're talking at this time, right?
No. So a lot of people, it is that we're talking at this time, but a lot of people forget this portion of it.
Yeah.
Is how often is that data coming in?
Got it.
Right. So your communication path is, how often is it communicating? Is it every second? Is it every 30 minutes? You got to make sure that you're communicating that to the controller, and it has to be a part of this point to point. You're identifying how often the rescan is,
Yes.
right?
Is that something you want to match to alarm priority? Like, hey, you have so much time to respond. Last thing you want to do is see a value that changes in 30 minutes.
Well, it's definitely something that you're considering when you're adding this, right?
Yeah.
When you're adding this new device and this point, you're definitely already identify whether or not it's safety related. Well, it should be in your process to identify what that refresh rate is, and that's where PHMSA is going to look at too. How often is this data available or refreshing?
Okay. And so next after that, you've got tag mapping, right? I get it. A controller is not in the business of creating tags. But what does this mean in terms of like SCADA, HMI, and mapping?
So you can have something being displayed locally and identified, or the programmer may have called it whatever it is, right, in the program, and then how that's being pushed to either to a local screen there, and how that's being transmitted to the control room in front of the controller.
Right.
So when you're looking at that, you want to make sure that you're the tag convention. You don't want to call something one thing and then it'd be something else.
Right.
And again, if you're displaying it locally there, we talked about this before. We want to make sure that we're carrying it through from the field to the control room, because again, you got to remember you're on site. You're calling it the valve number, whatever it is, and they'll know it as that valve, and they're like, I don't even see that on the screen.
Right.
So you want to make sure that you're tying those together.
Right. There's no mismatch.
Exactly. So you want to make sure that you correlate those and make sure that your description is accurate to what you're actually pointing to.
Got it. And then the last one we've got, you here when we're talking about what a point-to-point looks like, we're also covering alarms. So that's part of the component as well for set points, right?
Yeah, and that's huge here, right? Because now you're setting up a system or a new additional site, and maybe not everything's alarmed, but something that's alarmed is for a reason. So you want to make sure that you get that correct, and you want to make sure that you're scaling it. You make sure your units are accurate, and you want to make sure that message is clear.
Yeah.
You don't want to have an alarm come in and no one understand what this means. I don't know where to go. I don't even know where it's at as far as location. So within your process, you're identifying how you're setting up your alarms, and within your point-to-point procedure, you're gonna, call that out and how you're setting that up.
Got it.
And reviewing, interacting with the control room, making sure that you're actually seeing these hit the banner.
I have a couple of questions in terms of how a point-to-point looks. And here are my two questions. Number one is, when you're conducting the point-to-point, I recognize you want to involve the operator. Does it need to be the operator on duty, or do you designate someone that is not on shift during that point-to-point?
Well, you definitely want to identify someone that is familiar with the operations for that console or these assets, and you want to make sure that they're qualified. So however your operations is going to set up someone that to do a point-to-point, you definitely want to make sure that you take those into consideration.
So do you want to make sure they're OQ'd? Is that part of that?
Yes. So you definitely want to make sure that they're OQ'd, and you definitely want to make sure that they have access, to this location,
Right.
and that they actually review the procedures, the set points, make sure that they're reviewing the screen, the messages. You want to make sure that, if something is going to be triggered, again, if you're simulating values and things like that, you want to make sure that all those are coming in accurately.
Yeah.
There's been times where, maybe it's a gauge pressure versus, atmospheric, right? So you want to make sure that you have that as far as units being correct on your screen.
Yeah,
so,
calibrated.
yeah,
properly.
So especially if they're doing any type of shut-ins or, shutting down a valve or having an ESD go off. You want to make sure you're capturing these things correctly and making sure from a priority standpoint, you see that, right?
Right.
Say, this is a safety related point. How are we identifying this? Where does it look like on my procedure? And how does this look in point to point, and how are we documenting that?
Got it. I do have a question, another one, in terms of how a point-to-point looks. Hey, we cannot shut down this operation, and we need to go ahead and create a synthetic value for testing and point-to-point. Is that allowed? And if so, how do you document that?
Again, you're going to go ahead and point that to your plan and how you have that written. I can tell you how we've done it in the past.
Sure.
But everyone is going to have something where it's written. Say you have a block valve that you want to shut down, and you can't because of operations.
Right.
Well, it's identified within your process that you may not shut that down.
Got it.
So again, when you're in an audit and you're reviewing this section and they ask you these questions of, all right, well, how are you doing your point-to-point process? You want to make sure that you identify that, call that out, make sure it's spelled out correctly.
So it must be visible to the auditor as part of the process that it is documented and written that, in fact, if we cannot, here's this particular, it sounds like you got to be specific too.
Yeah.
This pipeline we cannot shut down due to operations. We've had to do, in our point-to-point process, we will create a synthetic value for this valve or this part of the pipeline, right? We document that, and it sounds like, do you put that anywhere else in terms of any sort of deviation or MOC, or is it just in the plan?
Well, it's in your plan, your process of how you're doing it, because that's really where they're going to find that data.
Got it.
Right. And then you also need to be able to address if you're not able to complete that point to point. Say something holds it up. How are you placing that information on hold, or at least that activity for that point to point? And again, these are things that you're going to want to spell out. Make sure that you have that all documented.
So at the end of the day, really the objective is to kind of catch any sort of mapping, scaling, any units, any logic errors. You're really looking for the controllers to rely on the point-to-point, and do a thorough a thorough review so that you kind of eliminate those blind spots, right?
Yeah, we definitely don't want to come back to make any corrections, and you can eliminate a lot of those things, right? You want to eliminate what you can. This is not a point-to-point is not where you're doing cleanup. This is where you're setting it up. You want to make sure you're setting it up correctly.
Got it. Yeah, so it's not just it's not meant to throw people under the bus and,
no,
like you said, try to clean it up. This is an active part of the entire process anyway if you're regulated in CRM.
Yes, that's correct.
Let's move on here, Daniel. Give us that real-world example. You've kind of called one out a little bit in terms of a mismap point. Kind of walk us through this.
Yeah, I mean, there's several to pull from, but yeah, absolutely. There's been times where transmitters have been swapped, when kind of remapping things. There's been times where, again, you're looking at the that data that's coming in, and again, it's not being represented correctly, or it's they brought something online like we have here, and that tag was kind of in the background.
Yeah,
no one was even seeing it.
Right.
And so again, these things are alarming, and you can't. You have issues that are happening at the field level.
Yeah.
That's a critical for any type of location. Again, I stated here is a compressor, right? And again, it's missed alarms and really unnecessary, right?
Yeah.
When you're doing a point to point, you want to make sure, again, if you're taking those steps, you're not going to have these situations kind of happen.
Got it. So in this real world example that you're talking about, let's get specific a little bit. So in this one, you're talking about a situation where a suction pressure transmitter basically at a compressor station was replaced, kind of during maintenance, and the integrator mapped the new transmitter to a nearby kind of line pressure instead of the actual suction point. right?
Yeah.
So when you're walking through these arrows, you've got the replacement actually occurs. There's a superficial check that happened. Would you think that that is probably what caused or contributes to the mismapping?
Yes. When you're not following your process all the way through, and you're, again, the scenario that we placed here on the screen, these things are going to happen.
Right.
And the last thing you want is, you have a suction pressure and a pipeline pressure swapped, right?
Yeah.
And the last thing you want is to be in an audit and you're doing an observation and they're in there with your controller and they're looking at a screen and they can't, you're kind of under the light here and you're identifying problems on your screen.
Right.
That's kind of the last thing you want, and again, this is not a cleanup. This is where you want to make sure when you're rolling this out, you're rolling it out correctly. And this is where it requires everyone to be on the same page to follow these procedures.
Yeah.
And have that documentation in place.
Got it. Now that we know what that kind of looks like, we've gone through this, scenario, and I'm sure you've got quite a few. Let's talk about a little bit, Daniel, on your safety-related points for the point-to-point. I think you got to prioritize certain things, and right here, you've called this out for us. Give us these. Hey, these are typical critical points that you want to look at, and then what's required when you're looking at those points.
Yeah. So your critical points, it could be, again, your transmitters that are providing MAOP or MOP, right? You have your valve statuses, from ESD, right? And then it could be at a station, whatever, right? So you have your critical levels and volumes, and then we have points that are feeding your leak detection system, so that's again, it's so critical to make sure that this process is one, set up correctly and it's being followed. You want to make sure that, you have a good start to these assets when you're bringing them online.
All right. So you've got that, and those verification requirements, aside from just focusing on which are your maybe these are your usual suspects for critical points, you're saying, hey, aside from that, you really want to have some verification requirements. The field reading's accurate. End-to-end data path looks good. There's good alarm behavior, and there's good safety logic, right? So if something has to fail open, fail close, whatever the case is, you're checking that box. In terms of safety logic, something latches properly. You want to make sure you've got good latch there. You also want. It sounds like you're also looking for intrinsically safe safety logic. Meaning, if I overpressure, I want something to shut down, right?
Yeah, there could be a time when they go out there and they're replacing something, or, again, you're testing your logic. It could be a calibration that they're doing out there, and they intentionally, right? They're intentionally doing this, and they calibrate it to where it should shut down the overpressure something.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen, right? And so, again, it needs to be corrected, and your plan should identify when that's going to happen. So not only are you identifying that there's a problem, when you can correct it,
right?
And especially if it's safety, so your safety related points, you definitely want to make sure that you're identifying those. It's within your plan, and making sure that everyone understands their process and their role when they're doing the point to point.
Yeah. So what's the evidence base? And once you've got the safety-related points, you're making sure you're looking at critical points. You've got your verification requirements. In terms of the audit, what's the evidence goal there?
Yeah, the evidence goal is being able to provide that record.
Yeah.
And the big part of that is making sure that, you're reviewing that record when it happens, right?
Yeah.
So if you're doing a point-to-point and, we're saying that everything's good to go, within your process of adding this, right,
Yeah.
Someone should be reviewing it, and this should be a part of your management change, right? Someone's reviewing this data and making sure that it's correct. You don't want to go back later, so you should be pulling your events. You should be pulling everything that you've triggered during these validation,
Right.
making sure that you can see what alarms were set, what they were set at, what the description was. So everything that you reviewed is all provided, whenever you go into an audit. This is not something you have to go back and try to, collect. You have it all ready to go. It's all presented, and it's a part of your process, and that's a part of your procedure.
Got it. So let's move on here. Give us, Daniel, you've given us our framework now, on the implementation guidance. Walk us through that framework real quick. That's going to help somebody. Again, if you're listening and watching, you're a controller, you're a supervisor, manager, you're in charge of CRM. You've now inherited some of this sometimes. You've been the person assigned, whatever the case is. One of the things we're doing on every episode is Daniel's really doing a good job of giving you some guidance and giving you a framework, right? So walk us through your framework right here on steps to stay compliant right here.
Yeah, I'll run through a few of these pretty quickly. So first step, you want to make sure that you define what triggers it. And again, this all leads back to your point-to-point SCADA change and process. It should list triggering, what it could be: instrument replacement, movement, of assets, rearrange, new points being added. So you're going to list those things out, right?
Right.
Change the scale, units, descriptions, all those things are being listed. So again, the biggest part is defining what triggers your point-to-point.
Yeah.
The next one here is standardizing your checklist, right? Making sure that it's being done correctly.
Right.
And create that checklist, with your technician from your SCADA group, and verify the local instruments, readings, and make sure that you have all that within, your standard checklist and document it, right? You pull in, typically you'll pull in your IP address, your description, your tag, what's being set up as far as alarms, identifying what's digital, analog, those units, and then also those safety-related points. If you've, if you actually simulated them, or how that was being triggered.
Yeah.
You'll have some type of documentation that will capture that information for your record. So standardize your checklist on what you have and what you're doing to make sure that you have that ready to go.
And then tie it back to your MOC. That's another one on your guidance, right?
Yeah, definitely tie it back to your MOC. Make sure that you capture, again, if you're adding something especially safety related, you want to make sure that you have that documentation in place. You want to make sure that, again, it's required, and the information that's being displayed is accurate.
Yeah. And then you've got the last step you really want to do is just preserve some records, it sounds like, for proof and evidence.
Yes, because everyone knows when you're in this audit, you definitely want to be able to really just grab that information and show it based off of, whatever regulated sites that are being reviewed.
Yeah.
Many times in the past and on a lot of my audits, I would sit there and make sure when something's being submitted or being, documented, I would always like to go in there and take a look at it. I always tell everyone, look at what you're approving before you move forward with it, because if you could correct it right then and there, that's the best time to do it, because we all get busy, right? You want to make sure that your records are accurate when they're uploaded or corrected as quickly as possible.
Right. So let's move on here, Dan. Let's cover some common misconceptions, clear up any doubts. I think these are always good to kind of cover, to clear up any confusion. There's always sometimes myths and things that you really want to clear up on a point-to-point. So let's run through a few of these that I think are a big deal. Number one is the point-to-point is only required for new installations.
Correct. So no, it's not.
Yeah.
And again, like we spoke about, it could be, replacements, relocation, rearrangements of maps, anything that's in your SCADA system, definitely providing that information to your controller.
Right.
You definitely want to look at that, make sure you have that process in place that addresses these questions that are going to be in your audit.
I think the second one's kind of people tend to brush on this one, but I think it's a big deal. Where is the point-to-point just a paperwork exercise?
Yeah, that again, it's making sure that everyone understands their role in this process. It's so critical when you're saying this up to make sure you're saying it up correctly. Last thing you want are things alarming incorrectly or confusion with the text of not knowing where this location is. So, I mean, for me, that's big, making sure from, the message all the way back down to the display of the screen, all that information is accurate and you can point it back.
Yeah. And then finally, you've got one here, do we have to point every point all the time?
No. Again, it's not something you have to do all the time. Again, you have to review your safety.
Yeah.
And it really needs to be defined within your alarm management plan and your risk of how you're doing this.
Got it.
You need to be able to speak to your process, your plan, and how you're going to answer this in front of a PHMSA or any state, regulator. You want to be able to speak to that and be able to show this is when this is being done.
Got it. Take us now, Daniel, on the last three things people should take away from this episode. You gave us a framework. We talked about when that point-to-point, what that really looks like. We talked about some real world. Give us your three major takeaways on this.
Biggest thing is knowing when the point-to-point is being triggered. Again, I can't speak to it enough. Have your process in place. That way, everyone knows when a point-to-point is being triggered, and making sure that everyone understands that process.
Right.
Next thing is, make your point-to-point structured. Again, it's from the end to end. You want to make sure that you're verified, from the field device all the way up to your SCADA screen, especially when it comes down to your safety-related points. Everyone should be able to trust what's on your SCADA system. Again, on the first slide, you don't want to lose that trust with the controller. You want to make sure that it's accurate. You want to make sure that they can rely on the data that's being displayed to them.
Yeah. So those are the major takeaways you talked about here, Daniel, is just know those triggers, structure your end-to-end. It's got to be taken seriously. It's not just a paper exercise, and you don't relegate the SCADA guy with the controller that he's on vacation, bring him in. That's not how you're going to do that. It's got to be a structured end-to-end, a full process, and document that you did it. Maintain your clear records that you did that.
Yeah,
right?
That's really the biggest part of it. I mean, if you don't have something to show, it didn't happen,
Yeah.
And that's the last thing you want. You want to be able to take credit for the things that you're doing, especially if you're spending a lot of time with it. It's overall, make sure that you're identifying who's a part of that process. So document, look at your procedure and how you're documenting that, and make sure that you have that ready to go.
Yep. Yeah, Daniel, so that's been helpful, man. I think we broke a lot of myths here. At the end of the day, you're really required to verify, that SCADA data. You got to implement your written triggers, give yourself a robust checklist, integrate your MOC in this entire process. I think that's in anything that you're doing on the PHMSA audit. And then have solid records, right? That's really what this is about. It's It's just following that path and making sure you do it. I think this has been a good episode. I think coming up next, Daniel, this is going to be an interesting part. Is episode 8, an internal communications plan and doing some manual operations. I think this one has been good. That's pretty much what happens when the screens go dark. That's going to be a good topic for us to discuss in the next episode.
Yeah, it's definitely, and again, everyone does things a little differently, but it's definitely, when you're in that audit and you have the questions, there could be a few things that may come up. So reviewing the section and knowing what you have in place is definitely going to be good for you before you head into that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been a good show. We appreciate it. Don't forget, if you're tuning in, you're watching us, you can like and subscribe. We want your feedback and we want your scenarios. Post them in there. We'll come back to them. We'll talk about them. We'll get those out there. Dive right in. We want to hear from you, especially if you're already a control room operator manager. You're someone in charge of compliance. And again, I'm your co-host, Mike Flores, along with our expert, Mr. Daniel Nieto, right here on this CRM mini-series, part of Offsite Energy. It's awesome. It's good.